Order. Question number 5. The Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Speaker, this question is to the Minister of Finance. And
Order. 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 So I'm on my feet.
yeah.
Now the House will give the Minister the opportunity to ask his question.
Yeah, Speaker,
Right,
I apologise. I wrote that last set of economic facts out on the back of it. That's why I meant to say.
Member, I'm trying to give him an opportunity now
I
to
thought
ask
some
his
people
question.
over there needed a lesson in economics. This question is to the Minister of Building and Housing. What policies does the government have to comprehensively deal with the demand side of New Zealand's housing challenge?
Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
Mr. Speaker, my responsibilities are primarily around growing housing supply, but the government has taken a number of measures on the demand side. Tax changes in Budget 2010 remove the right for building investors to deduct depreciation on buildings. This measure increased their tax liability by $700 million per year. Other tax changes include the Bright Line test introduced last year, the requirement for IRD numbers on all property transactions, and a $33 million extra for an IRD enforcement, and the withholding tax on housing investments, which took effect this week. Other demand measures include the LVR limits introduced by the Reserve Bank in October 2013, and the further limits on lending policies targeted at investment housing in 2015.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question. Right Honourable Winston.
Where in the comprehensive plan is the most critical thing that economists and now others are calling for, and that is a policy to seriously curb immigration demand, which is inflating house prices and demand in Auckland now and elsewhere?
Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
Mr. Speaker, my ministry has commissioned research quite specifically on the linkages between migration and house pricing. Actually, it's some months ago, and I'd be happy to share the results of the research that actually make a very interesting read.
Supplementary question, David Seymour.
Is the Minister at all concerned that his comprehensive plan might be so effective as to trigger an abrupt correction in house prices?
Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
Mr. Speaker, it's certainly clear that New Zealand house building investment is at the highest level ever. It's 30% higher than the last peak, and so on the supply side, we're making great progress. On the demand side, actually the thing that's making the greatest difference is the fact that Kiwis aren't leaving, and as a consequence we have record high population growth.
Point of order, David Seymour.
Mr. Speaker, the question was a very simple one. Was he concerned that the strategy might be overly effective? He made no attempt to address that whatsoever. He simply described some of the measures that were being undertaken.
I was distracted, or I'll hear from the Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Called for an opinion and he got it. I mean, essentially the Minister was trying to make a simple question more intelligible for the population.
Well, that part doesn't help. I think on this occasion the question has been addressed, clearly not to the satisfaction of the member. Further supplementaries? Supplementary question, the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Minister, what comprehensive plan can the government possibly have if it doesn't first include massively curbing immigration demand for housing in Auckland and elsewhere?
Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
Mr. Speaker, the big change that has occurred around migration is that 35,000 Kiwis are not going each year to Australia. Now, unless the member is proposing to block Kiwi citizens coming back to this country because this government has been successful in making it such an attractive country, then it actually won't make much difference.
Supplementary question, David Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What research has the government undertaken on the influence of migration on housing, and what does it conclude?
Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
Mr. Speaker, research was specifically commissioned by the National Institute of Demographic and Economic Analysis at Waikato University. It noted in its report that in Auckland, the bulk of the population was due to natural increase. To give the actual numbers, Auckland's population increased by 87,700 over the study period, of which 87% was the difference between births and deaths, and 13% was due to net migration. The report also noticed that the most dramatic change was the shift in New Zealanders not leaving, i.e. New Zealand's natural population increase has historically been shielded by the net loss of 35,000 Kiwis leaving. This has stopped. This has meant there's a stronger natural increase, and this means there's more demand for housing.
Question, Speaker.
Supplementary question. The Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Why is the Minister refusing to call it what it is when Kim Campbell, Chief Executive of the Employers and Manufacturers Association, is he a xenophobe, is he? Okay.
Order, just complete the question quickly.
Michael Riddell, former Reserve Bank economist, urging him to join the dots linking the housing crisis to record immigration.
Speaker.
Order. The Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
This government makes its policies on the basis of facts and evidence, not prejudice. And I would draw the members' attention to the research report from Waikato University that dispels the claims the member's making.
Supplementary question. David Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What was the conclusion of the study on migration and house prices?
The Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
Can I directly quote the report's conclusion? The literature and the available data on population change suggests that visa-controlled immigration into New Zealand, and specifically into Auckland, in the recent past has had a relatively small impact on house prices compared to demand factors such as the immigration changes of New Zealanders, low interest rates, investor demand and capital gains expectations. Consequently, changes in immigration policy which can only impact on visa-controlled immigration are unlikely to have much impact on the housing market, close quote.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question. Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Minister, if the government, when in opposition, was accusing another party of fueling the house prices and demand by mass immigration, I'm talking circa 2004.
Order, just complete
why,
the
when the
question.
record level now is 125,000 gross, 69,000 net, is he trying to defy gravity and say something else?
The Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
It is absolutely true that net migration is having an impact on the housing market. But what the member needs to understand is what's changed is that 35,000 New Zealanders are voting confidence with their feet. They're saying New Zealand's a great country to live in. They're coming here and they're adding to the housing pressures. And I actually think it's a great thing that New Zealanders are choosing to build their future in this beautiful country.
Question, Speaker.
Supplementary question. Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Given that under his watch the housing crisis in Auckland in particular and around the country now has dramatically worsened, why doesn't he do the decent thing and resign for another time?
The Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
Mr Speaker, I note when that member was Deputy Prime Minister, house prices doubled and they did absolutely zip. Absolutely zero. What I'm proud of is that house building in New Zealand is at an all-time record high because ultimately supply is the answer.
Point of order. Right Honourable.
Mr. Speaker, the statement just made by Nick Smith was about another era, another time, and it wasn't correct. I'm saying that what he told the House about when I was Deputy Prime Minister is utterly false, and he knows it.
Order. The member himself referred to the current government when it's in opposition in the previous supplementary. Point of order, the Honourable Jerry Brown.
Mr Speaker, I think the Honourable Winston Peters is quite right about that. He was Foreign Minister at the time, never in the country, and couldn't have been responsible.
Order. Neither points of order were much help to keeping order in this House. Question. Order. Point of order. Order. Point of order, the Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
Mr Speaker, I seek leave of the House to table the report dated the 13th of April 2016, by the National Institute of Demographic and Economic Analysis from the University of Waikato on the impact of immigration on house prices.
Is the report available publicly on a website?
No, it's not.
It is not. I will therefore put the leave to table that particular report from the University of Waikato. Is there any objection? Yes. There is objection. Question number 6. Todd Muller.